All right, and welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. I'm your host, Carter Wilcoxson, CEO and founder of Epic Services Company, joined again by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt and Joanne Eby, coming in from their final stages of their moving from Kansas City to Vegas. Welcome back. I know you two have been doing a lot over the last week since our last podcast. I know you're pretty exhausted. So I want to thank you again for finding the time today while you're in that transit mode that you are very, very, I can only even imagine, because you've got stuff going to Florida and to Nevada. So anyway, welcome back, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Carter. It's as I was saying to Joanne, it's exhilarating to do these things. We're kind of a mobile or a MASH unit for the fiduciary industry. We've been doing this for a long time, ever since year 2000. So we're kind of used to it to a certain degree. The physical aspect of it is sometimes a little bit much as we're in the throes of it. But I think that part of this is a mental process and getting in and writing the podcast and working together with you and Joanne. It's such an honor, as you've said many times, and then to bring it to the audience is just every week. And working with the team to try to bring the podcast and the productions and whatever has just been awesome. And the quality of this is top notch stuff. So thanks to everybody once again, and we'll hang in there and continue along with high quality productions every week.
Yeah, awesome. Joanne, you were saying pre-show actually that you're kind of exhausted. I know you are from a lot of boxing up and getting stuff organized or whatever, but it really is meaningful for you to be able to be here as one of our co-hosts.
Well, thank you. And I am looking forward to today's conversation. I think this will be interesting for our listeners.
We're going to just jump on into this, and this is episode number 25, which is hard to believe that we're one quarter through getting to 100, which is where we'll be before we know it. But, in our last episode, we opened what Matt called the black box of fiduciary discretion. We said that the profession usually sees the facts that go into a discretionary matter and the action that comes out. But the professional process connecting those facts and that authority to the action has largely remained invisible, hence the invisible threat. We describe fiduciary discretion as the interpretive work required when governing rules, and known facts do not fully determine what fiduciary responsibility requires. At the end of the episode, we left our listeners with a harder question, right? We left them on the edge. Once discretion becomes visible, what do we do with that knowledge? Can discretion be measured? And ultimately, can it be improved? Matt, is that our starting point for this episode?
Yeah, Carter, I think that's exactly where we're going to begin. So this is a continuation from our prior episode where we're talking about once we have that knowledge and we can see discretion, how do we take it and then potentially try to improve on discretion, which is a very great task to be able to try to take on. But we should begin carefully because the word improvement can potentially lead us in the wrong direction. In many organizations, when we say we want to improve something, we immediately want to measure it. And then we want to give it a score. And then compare that score with a target. And if the score is below the target, we want to correct the person or the process to close the gap, right? And that approach can be very useful when the activity is simply technical and the desired result is known. For example, did we complete an account review on time? Did we calculate the fee correctly? And those are legitimate questions. But fiduciary discretion presents a very different problem. If several conclusions may be legally permissible and professionally reasonable, what exactly would the score measure?
Well, therein lies the tension then, really, right? The moment we make discretion visible, someone's going to want a dashboard, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely. And that impulse is understandable. Boards, regulators, auditors, risk officers, and fiduciary leaders, they all want to see credible evidence that an institution is fulfilling its responsibilities. And they should want that evidence. The problem is not the desire for accountability. The problem is choosing a measure simply because it is available, even if that measure does not represent the thing we are actually trying to understand. An institution, for example, can count the number of discretionary distributions and the total amount distributed in any given month. It can count exceptions to policy on discretion. It can count committee approvals, denials, complaints, litigation, audit findings, or even examination findings. And those measures may reveal something important about volume, administration, or outcomes. But they do not measure the quality of the exercise of discretion.
And that's exactly right. The danger is that we will measure the container once again and believe we had measured what happened inside it.
That's interesting. So let me push on that just a little bit. Suppose an institution wants something objective. It does not want to rely on a manager saying, I know good discretion when I see it, right? That seems reasonable. So if we cannot use the outcome and we cannot simply use a fiduciary's experience, what would objectivity mean?
That's exactly the right question, Carter. Objectivity does not have to mean that every case has one correct numerical answer. It can mean that we use a disciplined and consistently applied method to examine the process. We can ask whether relevant fiduciary considerations were recognized. We can ask whether competing interests were genuinely examined. We can ask whether one factor dominated without justification. We can ask whether the fiduciary tested an initial interpretation against contrary facts or perspectives. We can ask whether the rationale connects the governing authority, the facts, the competing interest, and the proposed action. Those questions do not tell the fiduciary which answer to choose. They help us examine how the fiduciary's judgment formed.
And we need to distinguish three things that organizations often collapse into one: measurement, evaluation, and development. Measurement identifies and describes something according to a method, while evaluation applies criteria and reaches a judgment about quality. Development helps a fiduciary or an institution improve its capacity. We may eventually use all three, but if we move directly to evaluation before we know what we are measuring, we can create false precision. And if the first use of a new framework is to grade people, those people will learn to protect themselves from the framework instead of learning from it.
So you said a few things there. I like that false precision, right? But that last point feels super important. If a trust officer thinks the A-Fire framework outlined in our last episode is going to become a performance score, they may start documenting support for all 5 words just to satisfy the review.
Just like in so many other cases, it just becomes a checkbox. Anchors check, fairness check, identity check, risk check, emotions check. The file would look complete after the fact, but the exercise of discretion would remain just as invisible as it is now. We would only have converted a way of seeing into just another checklist.
And Matt, checklists, as you know, are not inherently bad. They are very valuable when they protect an organization against omission in a repeatable process. But a checklist cannot determine how much weight a consideration deserves in a particular case.
Well, let us bring back the tuition example from the last episode. Okay, so and listeners, here's the thing. I want you to understand. Like, we're gonna get a little bit more technical on this one, but bear with us here. So a beneficiary asks for $70,000 to pay a child's college tuition. Keep in mind, the college student is not the beneficiary of the trust. The beneficiary has other resources to pay for the college tuition of that child. The trust authorizes education distributions with their HIMSS powers, and there is a charitable remainder beneficiary. If one trust officer approves the request and another denies it, are we saying that either answer might reflect strong discretion?
Potentially, yes. And approval could reflect a thoughtful interpretation of the settler's commitment to education, the beneficiary's circumstances, the scale of the trust, and the effect on the remainder interest. But approval could also result from empathy dominating every other consideration. On the other hand, a denial could reflect a thoughtful concern for impartiality, sustainability, and the beneficiary's other available resource. But denial could also result from fear of criticism or from an institutional culture that treats no as simply the safest answer. The conclusion alone does not reveal which process occurred.
That means approval rates and denial rates must be interpreted very carefully. A high approval rate is not proof of beneficiary responsiveness, and a low approval rate is not proof of prudence. Uniformity is not proof of quality, and variation is not proof of failure. The pattern may give us a reason to inquire, but the pattern does not supply the explanation.
Perhaps the first principle is this: do not confuse a measurable outcome with the quality of the discretion that produced it, right?
So well stated. And I would add a second principle. Do not confuse elimination or lack of disagreement, elimination of the disagreement or lack of disagreement with improvement. If every member of a committee reaches the same conclusion because hierarchy silenced disagreement, that is not strong discretion. If every trust officer produces the same answer because policy has replaced interpretation, that is not strong discretion.
And that is the central institutional risk. In trying to control discretion, the organization can unintentionally eliminate the conditions needed in order to exercise discretion well.
So if improvement does not mean more approvals, fewer denials, faster answers, unanimous committees, or identical conclusion, well, then what does it mean?
So here's my proposition. Fiduciary discretion improves when the fiduciary becomes better able to recognize, test, integrate, and explain the fiduciary considerations that they used that responsibility requires in the exercise of discretion. The objective is not convergence on one answer. The objective is greater coherence.
Okay. Well, we used that word coherence in the last episode. So if you don't mind, define it again here because it is doing a lot of work.
And I think that's critically important. Coherence means that the fiduciary's understanding of the authority, the facts, the affected interests, professional role, relevant risks can be integrated into a rationale that makes sense as a whole. The parts do not have to point in the same direction, and in fact, we have shown they often will not point in the same direction. With respect to discretionary judgment, coherence is the disciplined handling of that tension.
So, coherence is not the absence of tension, I think is what you're saying, Matt. And coherence is not merely a well written paragraph. After all, and I've seen it myself, a talented writer can make a weak process sound persuasive after the fact. I think the question is whether the relevant considerations actually entered the exercise while the judgment was forming. Did the fiduciary notice the charitable remainder beneficiary before the matter reached committee, or only after someone challenged the recommendation? Did the fiduciary consider the beneficiary's other resources because they were relevant to the trust's purpose, or simply because policy listed them? Did the fiduciary examine why this request felt different from earlier requests? Did the fiduciary revise the recommendation when a new perspective exposed a missing consideration? Those are signs of a living professional process.
So let me see if I can put this into practical language. Strong discretion is not a straight line from request to answer. It's a process capable of being challenged and simultaneously capable of learning.
Well said. And it connects directly to a theory that emerged from my doctoral research. I called it the theory of fiduciary judgment and abbreviated it as TFJ. TFJ proposes that the exercise of discretion is recursive rather than linear. The fiduciary encounters the facts and the governing authority. The fiduciary interprets them through anchors, fairness, identity, and risk, the first four components of AFIRE, and then emotion, signals can affect the weight and urgency of those considerations. As the fiduciary reflects, receives new information, or encounters challenge, their understanding may change. Then they return to the facts and the authority with a different way of seeing the problem. That does not mean that the process should continue on and on forever. It means strong discretion can revise itself before it commits itself.
And that capacity to revise is especially important in a committee. A committee should not merely collect votes. The committee should improve the quality of what each participant can see, what each participant brings to the table. If the presenting officer enters the meeting recommending approval, hears a legitimate concern about the remainder beneficiary, and modifies the amount approved or the conditions under which they'll approve it, the change is not evidence that the trust officer arrived unprepared. It may be evidence that deliberation within that committee structure actually worked.
That's a pretty significant shift. In some organizations, changing your recommendation could look like weakness.
Oh, it definitely can, especially where people believe expertise means having the answer before entering the room. But fiduciary expertise should include the ability to recognize when another perspective improves your own understanding. And the institution should be asking, did the committee deliberation change anything? If not, was that because the original analysis was strong? Or was it because the meeting did not create room for meaningful challenge?
And Joanne, that gives us 5 possible dimensions of improvement that formal research could examine. First is recognition. Does the fiduciary identify the considerations that are materially relevant to the matter? Second is differentiation. Can the fiduciary distinguish the settler's intent from company policy, the beneficiary's interest from the institution's interest, and fiduciary risk from reputational discomfort? Third is integration. Can the fiduciary hold competing considerations together without allowing one to automatically erase the others? Fourth is responsiveness. Does the fiduciary's understanding change when new facts or legitimate challenges emerge? And fifth is articulation. Can the fiduciary explain how the authority, facts, interests, role, and risk support the action?
So let me ask, are those 5 things a new scorecard?
Absolutely not. At least they should not become one prematurely. They are simply research propositions. They are possible characteristics of a more coherent exercise of discretion. We would need to study whether or not they can be observed reliably, whether they hold across fiduciary activities other than simply distributions, whether other characteristics are missing, and whether they actually distinguish stronger processes from weaker ones. We should not present this as an emerging model as though it has already been validated, because it has not been validated.
And even after validation, the use will matter. A diagnostic used for reflection and coaching may be valuable before it is suitable for employee evaluation. A method used to compare how a committee responds to two different scenarios may not be suitable for ranking individual trust officers. An aggregate pattern may help an institution see that risk dominates its culture, but that does not mean a particular fiduciary should receive a low score for considering risk when making a discretionary judgment. The interpretation must remain faithful to what the evidence can support.
So improvement is not simply adding more factors. You could mention everything and still fail to do the work.
That's absolutely correct. And in fact, that's what we're seeing too much of right now. A fiduciary could mention all of the items in a process, looking at the governing instrument, beneficiary classes, the purpose of the trust, the portfolio, the policy, and the risks, and still avoid the central tension. Completeness matters for sure, but improvement also requires proportionality. Which considerations deserve the most weight here, and why? It requires examination. What assumptions am I making? What fact would cause me to reconsider? Whose interest is vivid and whose interest is easy to overlook? It requires integration. How do these fiduciary considerations fit together into a responsible course of action?
And sometimes improvement means making uncertainty explicit. A weak rationale often sounds more certain than the facts can justify. A strong fiduciary may say, the instrument clearly authorizes an education distribution. It does not tell us how to weigh the beneficiary's other resources against the settler's emphasis on education. Reasonable fiduciaries may balance those considerations differently. And here is why we are giving greater weight to the settlor's educational purpose in this instance. And here is how we address the remainder interest. So that type of explanation does not weaken the action at all. In fact, it shows that the fiduciary understands and can specify where authority ended and discretion began.
That may be honestly one of the most useful lines in this episode, and I'm gonna repeat it best I can. Skilled fiduciaries know where authority ends and can articulate where discretion begins. I love that.
Because when that boundary remains invisible, a professional preference can be mistaken for a legal requirement. A company practice can be mistaken for settler intent. Fear can be mistaken for prudence. Empathy can be mistaken for fairness. Experience can be mistaken for evidence. Improvement begins when those influences can be distinguished, articulated, and then examined.
Let's do this. Let us move from the concept to the institution now. What could a fiduciary organization actually do differently? Joanne?
Well, I would think the first thing would be to separate development from monitoring. If every conversation about discretion is treated as an audit test, people will understandably become defensive. The institution needs protected settings in which fiduciaries can examine how they reached a conclusion, compare their interpretations, and acknowledge uncertainty without assuming that every difference is a deficiency. Now, that does not eliminate accountability. It would create a place for professional learning before a gap is identified as an audit exception.
One practical method that we've used in the past is the use of common case scenarios. Give several fiduciaries the same facts and the same governing language. Ask each person to identify what they noticed, what they considered most important, what additional information would they seek, and what action would they recommend. Then compare the paths, not merely the answers.
That is different from a training exercise with an answer key, right?
Yeah, very different. The purpose is not to discover who guessed the preferred answer. The purpose is to expose variation that normally remains invisible. One fiduciary may immediately ask about the settler's pattern of paying for education. Another may focus on the amount remaining in the trust. Another may ask whether similar requests were made for other family members. Another may focus on the charitable remainder beneficiary. Another may notice that the beneficiary's requests created an emotional response. The comparison gives the group a larger field of vision.
And the facilitator would have to be careful. If seniority determines which interpretation is treated as correct, the exercise teaches deference to that seniority rather than discretion. If the discussion ends as soon as someone cites policy, the exercise would teach policy substitution rather than discretion. If emotion is treated as unprofessional, participants will learn to conceal it rather than examine its influence. The objective is disciplined comparison. What did each person see? What did each person miss? What changed after hearing another perspective?
Could that work with actual cases too?
Yes, with appropriate safeguards in place. An institution could conduct postmortem reviews of completed matters as part of administrative account reviews. What made this matter discretionary? What tensions were present? What alternatives were considered? What changed during deliberation? Did later information expose an assumption or an overlooked interest? And the purpose would not be to reopen the case. It would not be to relitigate every outcome with hindsight. It would be to learn how the institution exercises discretion.
And that distinction about hindsight is critical. An unfavorable outcome does not prove the original exercise was weak, and a favorable outcome does not prove it was strong. A postmortem review should examine the information available at the time and the process used to interpret it. Otherwise, the organization will teach fiduciaries to predict outcomes that could not have been known at the time.
All right. Well, what about committees? We've said throughout this series that a committee can either improve discretion or hide it.
Well, committees need a deliberative purpose. The agenda should make clear which matters require genuine exercise of discretion and which matters are administrative or technical. For a discretionary matter, the committee chair can invite challenge before seeking consensus. Someone can be asked to articulate the strongest fiduciary case against the proposed action. Someone can identify which beneficiary or interest is least visible in the presentation. The committee could ask whether the recommendation would change if one material fact changed. And the minutes can and should capture the significant tensions considered. Shouldn't be a transcript, and it shouldn't just reflect the final vote. But those significant tensions are important to include in the minutes.
Well, that kind of sounds like to me like structured dissent.
Intentionally so. But dissent should not become theater. The purpose is not to require someone to oppose every recommendation. The purpose is to prevent premature closure, which we've discussed in prior episodes. A well-placed question may be enough. What are we treating as fixed that actually requires interpretation? Or another example, are we protecting the trust or are we protecting the institution? An additional example, which interest would someone reviewing this matter later say we failed to consider? Those questions can reopen the exercise without dictating the result.
Leadership behavior matters too. If the highest ranking person speaks first, others may organize their comments around that spoken view. If disagreement is remembered during performance reviews, a legitimate tension will disappear. Those fiduciaries won't disagree in the future. If speed is rewarded, but reflection is criticized as indecision, then risk and habit will dominate. The organization shapes discretion even when its policies say nothing about discretion.
Okay, that connects this episode to the organizational research theme we identified in an earlier episode, right? People exercise discretion, but institutions shape how people exercise it.
That's exactly right. And that is why improvement cannot be assigned only to the individual trust officer. Suppose the trust officer recognizes a meaningful tension, but has just 12 minutes to prepare the matter. Suppose the committee has 40 items on the agenda, but only an hour to go through them all. Suppose the institution celebrates clean files, but never asks whether the rationale reflects actual deliberation. Suppose policies are so detailed that deviation feels dangerous, even when the governing instrument requires individualized interpretation. In those conditions, telling the trust officer to exercise better discretion misses the institutional cause.
Training also needs to change. Traditional fiduciary training understandably teaches law, governing instruments, policy, tax investments, operations, and appropriate documentation. Those foundations are absolutely essential. But a professional can know the rules and still struggle when the rules do not determine the answer. Development should also help fiduciaries recognize competing considerations, surface assumptions, test interpretations, tolerate responsible ambiguity, and explain why one consideration deserves greater weight in a particular case.
The development question changes from do you know the rule to what do you do when the rule leaves work for you to perform?
Precisely. And that's why discretion is work, not merely permission. The profession has invested heavily in teaching the boundaries of authority. It has invested far less in studying and developing what professionals do inside of those boundaries.
Yeah, so let me raise a concern from the other direction. Call it playing devil's advocate. Could all of this make the process too slow? I mean, not every distribution request can become a philosophical seminar.
Carter, that is absolutely a fair concern. Discipline does not and should not require endless deliberation. The depth of the process should be proportionate to the significance, complexity, uncertainty, and potential consequences of the matter.
And that observation takes us toward our next theme in the research agenda that we started 2 episodes ago. Not every fiduciary activity carries the same amount or kind of discretion. Before an institution can decide where stronger deliberation, oversight, or development is needed, it must identify where significant fiduciary discretion actually occurs. We call those, and the regulations call those, significant fiduciary activities, or SFAs. But before we move there, we should place some guardrails around the improvement project.
Well, let us name them. What should the profession avoid?
First, do not use an emerging framework like AFIRE as a validated measurement instrument. It has not been validated yet.
Second, do not assume that balance means giving every consideration equal weight.
Third, do not standardize one professional identity as the ideal fiduciary.
Fourth, do not treat emotion as misconduct merely because it is present. Anxiety may signal uncertainty. Empathy may reveal a human consequence that the file does not communicate. Frustration may signal fatigue or a repeated pattern that needs examination. The question is not whether a fiduciary feels something. The question is whether the emotion is recognized and whether it is informing or distorting the exercise of discretion.
Fifth, do not confuse supporting documentation with introspection. Improvement requires methods that examine discretion while it is forming, not only explanations created after the fact.
And sixth, do not weaponize reasonable disagreement. Disagreement is data.
Yeah, and we've said that on previous episodes many, many times, right? So the profession has to protect the very data it wants to study. If people are punished for revealing how they differ, the black box closes again.
So well stated again, Carter. Visibility without psychological and professional safety can produce concealment rather than improvement. And accountability without valid knowledge can produce compliance theater. The goal is neither unrestricted personal preference nor mechanical uniformity. The goal is disciplined fiduciary discretion that is visible.
Okay, well, we're winding down here, and I know there's been a lot, and I forewarned you, listeners. You bear with us because we're going to get pretty deep here, pretty kind of technical. But before we close, let us give our listeners the 3 aha moments from this conversation. Joanne, what would you say would be the first?
For me, the first is that what can be counted is not necessarily what needs to be understood. The approval rates, turnaround times, exceptions, complaints, completed documentation, those are the things that are often counted. And while they may provide useful evidence, they do not by themselves reveal the quality of the discretion that produced an action.
All right, Matt, let me ask you the same question.
Yeah, I think for me, improvement does not mean that reasonable fiduciaries always reach the same answer. Discretion improves when fiduciaries become better able to recognize, test, integrate, and explain the fiduciary considerations that particular fiduciary responsibility requires.
All right, and I'm just going to give my 2 cents here. The third for me is that an institution cannot improve discretion merely by telling individuals to exercise it better. Committee design, hierarchy, time, policy, incentives, training, and the safety to express disagreement all shape what fiduciaries are able to see and to say, right? So, we began this episode with the natural question that follows visibility. Can fiduciary discretion be improved? The answer appears to be a resounding yes, but only if we are careful about what improvement means. It does not mean turning discretion into a formula. It does not mean grading the conclusion without understanding the path. It does not mean forcing experienced professionals to agree. And it does not mean replacing judgment with just a checklist. What do you think about that, Joanne?
Well, improvement means strengthening the fiduciary's and the institution's capacity for disciplined consideration. Can relevant interests be recognized? Can authority be distinguished from policy and preference? Can assumptions be surfaced? Can competing considerations be held together? Can legitimate challenge change the fiduciary's understanding? Can the final rationale explain not only what was done, but why responsibility required that course of action?
And those are propositions for formal research, not claims that the profession already possesses a validated measurement system. We need to describe the phenomenon. We need to test whether the proposed characteristics can be observed. We need to learn how context, experience, role, emotion, hierarchy, and organizational conditions affect the process. Only then can we determine what can responsibly be measured, evaluated, and developed. The profession does not need a score that creates the appearance of objectivity. It needs knowledge that makes responsible improvement possible.
That leaves us with the practical problem. An institution cannot apply the same depth of inquiry to every discretionary activity. It needs to know where discretion is most consequential, where reasonable professionals may disagree, and where distortion could create meaningful fiduciary risk. In other words, it needs to know where its SFAs are.
And that is where we're going to go next, Carter. A great segue and intro. From understanding and improving fiduciary discretion to locating it inside the institution. What makes an activity a significant fiduciary activity? How is an SFA different from a high-risk process, a key control, or a material transaction? And what would change if an institution built an inventory around the places where fiduciary discretion is actually exercised?
And that will be our next conversation. Most organizations move past these topics. We don't. For Joanne and Dr. Matt Eby, I'm Carter Wilcoxson, thanking you for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. And make sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you do listen. Dr. Matt, Joanne, I know we got deep. We got really into the weeds, I guess, if you will, but that was so engaging. And thank you so much for taking our listeners through that journey that we just got through going through.
Well, it's going to be one of those episodes that's going to be reference material. I don't think this is a light listen to on the walk around the block. It's going to be something that's going to be in the archives, and people are going to use this in the future and refer back to episode 25 as such a key episode as they are learning and training and developing their own ability to become better fiduciaries.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So, well, you guys be safe in your travels, and you're moving out and everything. I'm pretty sure we're going to be able to get into episode 26 next week. So, listeners, thank you so much again for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast, and we will see you next time. Thank you, everybody.